Hello and welcome to Fedallah and Crew. I've been wondering about the topic of my first video for a long time. For it matters that I begin this journey on an issue that is close to my heart, instrumental to my thinking, and also in line with the central logic of the channel, which is why I'd like to focus on minor characters in literature. Issues of marginality in general and their representation in fiction have been among my primary concerns in research and pedagogy. To some extent, it's even personal. I remember friends and colleagues joking about my doctoral research on Moby Dick and his most marginalized character, the Parsi Fedallah. They would tell me that my work on Fedallah is partly rooted in my personality as an introverted, fairly non-social person, which is true enough, but more significantly, I was and remain drawn to minor characters because of my socio-political concerns and commitments. Back then, my lived experiences as an international student, firstly in Southeast Asia and then in Western Europe, made me aware of my global presence as a person of color and drove my research towards voiceless and silenced representations in fiction. Even after my return home and the beginning of my career, despite my individual and professional privileges, I have remained sensitive to my own and others' experiences of marginality, precarity, and vulnerability under various conditions of inequality. But let's return to the matter at hand. Why is it important to study minor characters? Any introductory course to literary studies equips students with the tools of character study, specifically the knowledge to identify protagonists and antagonists, heroes and anti-heroes, foils and confidants, round and developing versus stock and static characters. And the examples we study in school are almost always drawn from the narrative center of literary works, and even the texts themselves are chosen from the canons of Western literature. We learn about the epic journeys of Beowulf and Sir Gawain, the soul-searching of Shakespeare's Hamlet, the personal and social struggles of Jane Austen's Emma and George Eliot's Dorothea. But what if we change our priorities? In One versus the Many, Minor Characters and the Space of the Protagonist in the Novel, Alex Wallach writes about the mechanics of marginality and resistance in fiction and demonstrates how narrative attention is distributed in realist fiction. He argues that a distributional matrix is at work in the space of any novel or work of fiction, which determines the position of each character in their character system. Think of the concept of character system as the society of characters in a work of fiction, which, like our own human communities, may be organized along social hierarchies of race, class, gender, sexuality, and any other marker of status. As Wallach argues, because a character system is not just composed of interacting individuals, like two characters in conversation, but also of intersecting character spaces, like a character shooting another dead or infringing on another's rights, major characters occupy a referential core that is reinforced by the peripheral representation of minor characters. Needless to say, Wallach also recognizes the principle attributed to the French philosopher Michel Foucault, that wherever there is power, there is also resistance. And so Wallach argues that every minor character possesses an orientating consciousness that, if responsibly explored, enfolds the untold tale into the telling. In other words, every minor character, even if completely voiceless and disenfranchised, regardless of their author's intention, contains within them a parallel world that can and should be unearthed from the margins of the main story world. Inspired by Wallach's simple yet profound study of narrative, I should add that the rediscovery of minor characters does not only depend on the internal complexities of a work of art, but perhaps more so on the reader. For it is the reader who should, in dialogue with the text and the world surrounding it, exercise their imagination in an ethical manner. For instance, in 1952, the Trinidadian writer C.L.R. James, while detained in New York and on the verge of deportation from the United States for his subversive activities, wrote a fascinating book on Melville's Moby Dick from the perspective not of its famous narrator Ishmael, but from the perspective of the ship's multi-ethnic crew, all of whom toiling under the tyranny of Captain Ahab. For James, the marginality of Melville's castaways paralleled his own precarity as an immigrant under persecution in the era of McCarthyism in the United States. Here's another example. In 1966, the Dominican-British author Jean Rhys published her novel White Sargasso, which tells the origin story of Antoinette Causeway, a character whom would be renamed Bertha Mason as the Creole wife of Mr. Rochester in Charlotte Bronte's 1847 novel Jane Eyre. By foregrounding the minor, and indeed hidden character of Bronte's novel as the protagonist of her own, Rhys explored the racial and sexual tensions of European colonial expansion in the Caribbean. C.L.R. James and Jean Rhys, to name but only a few, were pioneering voices in post-colonial feminist and critical race theory who inspire us to read for and on behalf of, or as I prefer it, to listen to, the untold tales of minor characters. So, as you may have guessed from my trailer video, the title, Fedallah and Crew, registers my own interest in hidden and marginalized story worlds. Down the road, I will post a series of videos called Close Readings to share some concrete examples of interesting minor characters that I have found inspiring and meaningful over the years. Most recently, reading towards a new research project, I have become interested in the representation of non-human animals as minor characters in literature. And I find myself increasingly fascinated by the growing field of critical animal studies. These are two of the questions that I'm learning to ask but used to ignore. What are the implications of listening to animal voices in fiction and of choosing to grant them subjectivity, personhood, and a point of view? Well, this in fact could be the topic of a future episode. What I should like to say in conclusion is that regardless of your political persuasion, be it to critique sexism, racism, or speciesism, or even if you are apolitical, it would be far too limiting to only read the story at the center of the narrative, that which is in the possession of major characters. I believe that there is more to minor characters than meets the eye, and much more to them than catches the ear. Thank you. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe and become a crew member. See you soon.